بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Yalla, someone join so I'm not talking to myself. The worst thing is that nobody's in the room. MashaAllah, Kamal has just joined. MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I was saying, when I was talking to myself here by myself, is that when you see the recording after the live session, it records from the beginning, so nobody's in the room, but you're just kind of sitting there waiting. But the recording is capturing that, so I had to speak a little bit to give the people in the future some entertainment. Inshallah, we'll wait like a couple seconds, maybe like 30 seconds or a minute, and then we'll get started. Bi'idhnillah. I hope everybody's doing okay. La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. I'm wearing my my Sira intensive shirt. So we got Sira intensive. This is from when I did Sira intensive with Qalam back in 2016. And I get roasted for wearing this shirt all the time. So, Assalamu alaikum Ibrahim, how are you, man? It's good to see you. It's good to see your emoji, I guess. It's good for you to see me. Okay, let's get started. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillahi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So today, inshallah, I wanted to kind of build off of what Tariq was talking about yesterday, and about how the Prophet ﷺ was C era. Okay, just don't roast my shirt, man. Come on. Yeah. So I wanted to talk about what the Prophet moving from what Tariq was talking about yesterday about the Prophet ﷺ, about his childhood and kind of the difficulty he went through in Halima Sa'diyah. I wanted to kind of like zone in on one thing that I think that we kind of we have it down as a date, as something that happened in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, but I think we don't spend the time to think about just how tough that was. And that was the death of his mother, Aminah bint Wahb. And what's so tragic about this loss, and he's 6 years old, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when this happens, and he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's traveling with Baraka, also known as Ayman, who was also his wet nurse, right? She lived with them, and they were traveling, him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Baraka and his mom, and they were traveling actually to Medina. And when they were in Medina, word was getting around that the mother of the Prophet ﷺ, Aminah, she was getting a bad vibe. And if you guys remember from the Sirah, there were people in Medina who were expecting the Prophet ﷺ to come. They were expecting that. So they were looking for somebody with those signs. So Aminah started to get this bad vibe, and she's like, okay, we need to leave. From that point, she actually falls ill, and slowly she passes away. And the Prophet ﷺ has to bury his mother at this young age. And shortly after that, as many of us know, who also passes away, the Prophet ﷺ goes under the care of Abdul Muttalib. And then what happens after that? What happens to the Prophet ﷺ? Abdul Muttalib also passes away. And this is when the Prophet is about 8 years old. And I wanted to kind of take a second and think about reflecting about why the Prophet ﷺ had to go through so much tragedy, right? And I think many of us, when we go through tragedy in our lives, that question pops in our head, right? That why do I have to go through this tragedy, this difficulty? And what we see in the life of the Prophet ﷺ is that the Prophet actually experienced so much loss, alayhi salatu wasalam. He lost his father before he was born. He lost his mother at a young age. He loses his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. And Abdul Muttalib loved the Prophet ﷺ so much. And one day they're gathering with all the chiefs. And the Prophet ﷺ, he's just a little kid at this point. He's like, 6, 7 years old. He runs up and he sits on Abdul Muttalib's chair. And Abdul Muttalib at this point, he's like the de facto leader, right, of Quraysh, or of his tribe. And the Prophet ﷺ goes and sits on the chair, and people are telling him, like, hey, like, what are you doing? Like, get down. Just as like I'm sure many of us experience from our parents, right, when we're acting up as kids. But Abdul Muttalib says, "Da'u فَإِنَّهُ يُرَى مَلِكٌ." Leave him because he looks like a king sitting up there, right? So Abdul Muttalib had a real soft spot for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and subhanallah, and maybe you could say part of it was that Abdul Muttalib also loved the father of the Prophet so much, Abdullah, and it was said that Abdullah was the apple of his father's eye, right? Abdul Muttalib loved his son Abdullah, and by further he loved his grandson, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And now the Prophet is 8 years old, and he's lost his beloved grandfather. And we see later throughout the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he goes through all of this loss, and we'll get into it inshallah throughout Ramadan. And the question pops in our mind is, what was the wisdom to have the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam go through so much loss? And some of the scholars, they mention that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because he went through so much loss, it made him sensitive to the pain of others. And I'm sure many of us, like I can even speak to myself, that the difficulties that I've went through in life have made it so that I can empathize with somebody else going through difficulty, right? That I see somebody struggling, whether it's through financially, emotionally, or even with their deen, and I can empathize with that. Why? Because I can think about the struggles that I went through, right? And while I'm going through those struggles, they're so difficult, they're so hard, they're difficult on the heart. But when you see somebody else going through that struggle and you're able to help them, you thank Allah that, alhamdulillah, that I'm able to help this person. I'm in the position that I can help this person. Why? Because I went through a similar struggle before. I can console this person, I can comfort them, I can understand what they're going through. And one really interesting situation that shows this is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where people called him and they said, "Ya Rasulullah, there's a woman, she's grieving her son in the graveyard, and she's like going crazy. She's like crying, she's hitting herself." And this was the practice of the Arab before Islam, and it's prohibited, right? And she's like wailing, and so the Prophet ﷺ, he goes to the graveyard to try and talk to this lady. And so he goes up to her and he tells her like a sabr, right? Patience, be patient, be patient, endure, get reward for being patient. And then she doesn't look around, she doesn't look behind her, she doesn't know who's talking to her. She says, "Get away from me, you've never experienced anything like I've experienced. You don't know the pain that I'm going through." And so the Prophet ﷺ, what does he do at this point? Out of a mercy in his heart for the believers, for the ummah, he leaves this woman. He leaves her to finish her grieving, and he goes. Later, people come to her and tell her, "Do you know who that was who you were just yelling at? That was the Prophet ﷺ." And immediately this lady, it was like a light or like a switch went off in her head. She goes and she runs to the Prophet ﷺ. She said, "Ya Rasulullah, asbir, I'll be patient. And this is when the Prophet ﷺ, he says the famous statement, "Innama sabru عند الصدمة الأولى." That indeed true patience is at the first strike of calamity, right? And one thing that we see here with the Prophet ﷺ is that he was able to understand this lady's struggle. He could have told her, "Hey, turn around, look who you're talking to," right? He could have pursued, but he knows what it feels like to hurt. He ﷺ knows what it feels like to have pain. And because of that, it allowed him to take a step back and leave her to finish her grieving. And one of the scholars, they were saying that the Prophet ﷺ, that sadness that he went through, it rid his heart, or it added softness to his heart, to the believers, right? Where we see that the Prophet ﷺ gets extremely emotional at the loss of his companions, and he gets extremely emotional at the sight of them as well. That he has so much love and care for the Sahaba, and this is what made them connect with him so on such a close level, because each Sahabi felt like the Prophet ﷺ loved them the most. And where are we going with all of this? The idea here is that there can be reasons why we go through struggles that we don't know what the reason is at the time. That the Prophet ﷺ went through so much pain and so much difficulty and so much struggle, but we see throughout his life that those struggles, that pain, made him a stronger individual. It made him a more empathetic individual. It made him a person who could understand the struggle of others. And as the brother mentioned, even enduring that pain and being patient through that pain and through that difficulty is reward in and of itself. And one example that we see here is the example that Tariq was mentioning yesterday, right? So Tariq yesterday mentioned the story of Halima Sa'diyah. And something that's so interesting is that Halima Sa'diyah, after the Prophet ﷺ came to her, what happened? All of her crops were way better than the rest of her neighbors. Everybody else was experiencing a drought, and they didn't have any money, they didn't have any crops, and she was, she had nothing to worry about. But what had to happen first for her to get to that point? She had to go through some difficulty. Why? Because of the fact that she went through difficulty, she had a slow mount, right? She had a donkey that she was riding on. Because her donkey was slow, she came last to Mecca to get a kid. Because she was last to Mecca to get a kid, the only kid left was the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ was the only kid left. Why? Because he was an orphan as well. So because of that suffering and difficulty, Halima Sa'diyah was able to experience this huge amount of rizq. So it's important to understand that struggle, those difficulties that we go through, there is a grander wisdom behind it. But what's asked of us is just to react to it properly. I think like one thing that kills me so much is like I've heard somebody say that, if you get sad or like depressed or you're like too stressed right now about Corona, like you don't have faith in Allah, you don't have like a strong iman. And while a strong iman or having a weak iman can lead to doubt and things like that, a person feeling like anxious or sad or something like that doesn't equate that person having a weak iman, right? We see an example of the Prophet ﷺ when he's crying over the loss of his son Ibrahim, and the Sahaba comes to him and tells him, "Anta ya Rasulullah, anta, like even you cry ya Rasulullah." And he sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, "Innaha rahma, innaha rahma, innaha rahma." Like it's a mercy for me to be able to cry and express these emotions in this way, right? And he sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says the famous statement where he says, "Inna al-ayna latadma' wal-qalba layahzan, wa la naqulu illa ma yarda Allah." That indeed the eyes they tear and the heart grieves, but we don't say except that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's kind of our like standard, right, for dealing with difficulty, dealing with trials, is that it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to cry, right? We see in the example of Yaqub alayhi salam that Yaqub cried until he became blind in grief. But does that mean that Yaqub alayhi salam was lacking in faith? No, a'udhu billah. Right? That Yaqub alayhi salam as a prophet had, the utmost faith. But those human emotions that we feel are okay to feel. And I think that's really important, especially for people kind of like trying to get more religious, trying to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I feel like maybe, I don't know, there's some kind of self-doubt that sometimes happens, where sometimes we think that there's something wrong with my iman because I'm kind of like, I'm sad, I'm down, that Allah doesn't love me because I'm going through this difficulty. And the reality is that that's not true. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's love is not determined by the fact that you're going through difficulty. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loved the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam more than anything else, more than any other human, right? But who did he try? Who did he go through? Who went through those tests? It was the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was the Prophet alaihi wasallam who went through those tests and difficulties, even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loved him so much. Alayhi salatu wasalam. And so, the last thing I want to say about this, about the Prophet going through difficulties, is that even though he sallallahu was deprived, or he lost so much, he lost, his mother, his father, he lost his sons, he didn't have siblings. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted him almost like you could say replacements, right? Where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would say about Barakah, also known as Ayman, he would say, "Hiya ummi ba'da ummi." She's my mother after my mother, right? That he had this motherly figure. He had Abu Talib as this fatherly figure, right? That when he would go to Ayman's house, and she would ask him, "Are you fasting? Have you eaten?" And he said, "No." She said, "Are you fasting?" He said, "No." She said, she would insist, like, "You're going to eat," right? Just like a mother would. So the Prophet ﷺ, Allah didn't deprive the Prophet ﷺ of that love, right? Of that care. But the Prophet ﷺ went through those difficulties, and it made him sallallahu alaihi wasallam softer in his heart and able to even understand more the struggles that we go through on an individual basis, right? And that's why, 1400 years later, billions of Muslims all around the world can connect to the Prophet ﷺ, can love the Prophet ﷺ, can feel that the Prophet ﷺ understands the struggles that we go through as in our day-to-day lives because of the struggles that he ﷺ went through as well. So that's all I wanted to share. Barakallahu feekum. Jazakumullah khair everybody for attending. Assalamu alaikum to everybody who said assalamu alaikum. And inshallah we'll see you guys all tomorrow. Take care everybody. Assalamu alaikum.